Have you ever wondered what humanity might have forgotten, not by accident, but by design? In the silence between ancient scrolls that no longer breathe, in the ashes where ink once whispered truths across centuries, there lingers a question that refuses to vanish. What was in the Library of Alexandria that someone didn't want us to know? A flame, yes. But was it only fire that took the knowledge away? There are burn marks in our memory, voids where civilizations should have spoken to one another, languages we were never allowed to learn, names that were never meant to be remembered. And somewhere in that vast, unlit corridor of time, something was taken from us and replaced with silence. You are now stepping into that silence, and perhaps if we listen closely enough, it will begin to speak. Welcome to historic sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. It begins not with a date, but with an absence. There is no precise moment recorded, no singular event inscribed in granite or remembered in liturgy. The fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria left no clear timestamp, only shadows. What we think we know, of Julius Caesar's accidental blaze, of riots, of religious purges, is stitched together like a tapestry missing half its threads. Too many hands rewrote the narrative. Too many eyes looked away. And still, something about that absence pulses, like an echo traveling through the hollows of time. There's a curious tension in how the story survives. One version speaks of Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE and the fire that spread from the docks to the scroll warehouses. Another tells of Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria in the 4th century CE, destroying pagan temples and with them their attached libraries. Yet another whispers of Caliph Omar in the 7th century, ordering the final volumes burned because they contradicted the Quran or merely duplicated it. But if we're honest, none of these accounts agree. Not in detail, not in certainty. Some historians even argue that no single fire destroyed the library. They suggest a slow, corrosive erosion, a forgetting by fragments, not a catastrophe, but a conspiracy of time and intent. And perhaps that's more frightening, because if knowledge can be erased not by fire, but by silence, who decides what should remain? It is said that the Library of Alexandria held over 400,000 scrolls at its peak. Others claim 700,000. These were not merely books, but lifelines, translations of Babylonian star charts, Egyptian temple lore, early Buddhist philosophy brought by emissaries from Ashoka's India, entire medical systems, treatises on sound, optics, alchemy, and theories, unfinished, half-glimpsed frameworks that may have anticipated discoveries we now attribute to modernity. The story of Eratosthenes calculating the Earth's circumference with mere shadows and distance, that came from Alexandria, the first murmurs of heliocentrism, buried in the notes of Aristarchus, forgotten for 1,700 years. What else never surfaced again? What fragments remain, misattributed, misunderstood? There is a term among certain rare book archivists, Damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. In ancient Rome, it meant not just erasing a name, but chiseling it out of marble, melting down the statues, and pretending the person never lived. The library's destruction feels like a civilizational damnatio memoriae, but not of a person, of an entire layer of human knowing. And that invites a deeper question. Was it negligence, accident, or was someone, some group, some hand in the shadows, motivated to remove the connective tissue between civilizations? Think of what it meant for Alexandria to exist. It was a syncretic city, where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and later Jewish and Christian thought converged. Where the Ptolemies ordered every ship docking at the harbor to surrender its scrolls for copying, sometimes returning the copies, sometimes not. The city devoured knowledge, layered it, synthesized it. If power lies in stories, what greater power than owning the world's forgotten stories? But power also lies in what is untold. We speak often of the past as though it is fixed, factual, inert. But history is authored. And the more centralized the authorship, the more fragile the truth becomes. The Church Fathers who would later build the theological foundation of Europe, they too passed through Alexandria, or their ideas did. But imagine if the pagan manuscripts on metempsychosis or the Gnostic Gospels buried in the sand had been woven into canon rather than cast out. Would Christianity have taken a different shape? Would it have absorbed the cosmos instead of opposing it? And deeper still, what if the library held texts that revealed cycles of rise and collapse, of knowledge gained and burned again and again? Might the scrolls have hinted at civilizations older than we care to admit? Not Atlantis in myth, but cities buried beneath layers of denial. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, was unearthed only recently, an intricately carved megalithic structure that predates known agriculture, upending timelines we held dear. What if Alexandria held interpretations of structures like that? What if early scholars had already begun to question the linear path of progress? But perhaps that was the danger. If knowledge shows us we are not the apex, but a recurrence, then who are we, really? There are those who believe, not without basis, that the erasure of the library was not merely a loss, but a reset, a cultural reformatting, the replacement of pluralism with hierarchy, of inquiry with doctrine, a move from multiplicity to monopoly, of thought, of God, of time itself. And still, through the cracks, something seeps. Fragments survive, sometimes literally, charred papyri in remote deserts, or copies made by Arab scholars during the golden age of translation. Sometimes conceptually, myths whose metaphors preserve long-buried scientific truths. A snake biting its tail, a tower touching the sky, a voice whispering from a burning bush. But mostly, what remains is the absence, the hum beneath what we know. And in that hum, you might feel the question, what knowledge are we living without? Not just about stars and stones and herbs, but about how to be human across epochs. About how the past speaks to the present, not to dictate, but to awaken. Tonight we stand at the edge of that firelight. We do not yet know what lies beyond the ashes, but we can begin to listen. A city can vanish, yes. Walls crumble, statues wear down to dust, and even pyramids fracture under the weight of centuries. But the question that haunts the ruins is never what vanished. It is always why. Why Alexandria? Why did the most ambitious archive of human thought become the most iconic silence in our collective memory? No single answer will suffice. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the design was not in destruction, but in confusion. In the crafting of so many conflicting stories that no one could ever quite reassemble the truth. There are those who say the first burning was unintentional. that in Caesar's campaign against Pompey, a fire set to enemy ships spread uncontrollably and reached the warehouses where scrolls were kept awaiting transcription into the great library's core. But even this account comes from sources written decades later, colored by politics, distance, and agenda. And what of the other fires? The looting during Aurelian's reconquest in the 270s? The destruction of the Serapeum, perhaps the daughter library, under Theophilus in 391? Which flame, if any, marked the final erasure? Or was it not fire at all, but a slow bureaucratic strangulation, century by century, scroll by scroll? And yet, beneath all these questions, another begins to stir. What kind of knowledge was so dangerous that it could not be allowed to persist? Not heresy in the modern sense, not merely spiritual disobedience, but something deeper. A knowledge that rearranges reality, that unsettles the foundations of power. Consider this. Among the scholars believed to have worked in the library was Hypatia, a mathematician, philosopher, and astronomer who taught Neoplatonism, a vision of the universe where reality was layered, fluid, and deeply interconnected. Her murder by a Christian mob in 415 was not just the end of a life, it was the end of a lineage. Her death marked the closing of a door between ancient knowledge and a rapidly narrowing worldview. We tell ourselves the story of progress, that science advanced steadily from Alexandria to Copernicus, to Newton, to Einstein. But the gaps in that story gape wide when we dare to look. When we notice that ancient Indian texts described the atom, that early Babylonian tablets charted Venus's cycles with astonishing precision, that Pythagoras was perhaps a student of Egyptian mystery schools, when we realize that what we call modern may have been remembered, not invented. In Alexandria, the walls bore inscriptions in many tongues. Greek, yes, but also Demotic Egyptian, Aramaic, Sanskrit. It was not merely a Greek endeavor, it was a crucible, a convergence point. And such places are always fragile, especially when empires rise with a single god, a single truth, a single vision. The rise of orthodoxy, whether religious or political, fears ambiguity. And the library overflowed with ambiguity, with ideas that could not be easily systematized, cosmologies that placed the divine within, not above. Healing systems that saw body and spirit as inseparable. Histories that stretched further back than sanctioned timelines allowed. There is a peculiar discomfort in imagining that our species may have known more earlier, that we may have glimpsed the stars not as metaphor, but as code, that we may have understood the subtle harmonics of the body, the language of plants, the cycles of time, and then let them slip. Or worse, chose to bury them. In a document recovered from Nag Hammadi, a Gnostic manuscript likely hidden during the early purges of non-canonical texts, there is a passage that says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not, it will destroy you. One wonders what was not brought forth." Perhaps in the library were scrolls that explored consciousness not as a byproduct of biology, but as a field, something to be tuned, expanded, even shared. There are tantalizing fragments from ancient sources that hint at altered states used for learning, dream incubation as a method of problem-solving, initiatory rites that taught without words. Such claims are not fantasy. They appear in early Egyptian dream temples, in the Eleusinian mysteries, in texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Did Alexandria preserve the blueprints for a different model of mind? And if so, Who found that intolerable? In our own age, knowledge multiplies, but depth fractures. We scroll endlessly, but learn shallowly. Our memories are outsourced to silicon. And still the silence from Alexandria whispers. It suggests a time when learning was sacred, slow, embodied, when wisdom was not information, but transformation. Some scrolls reportedly housed commentaries on Atlantis, not the myth, but the metaphor. Plato's account was never presented as mere legend. He placed it within a dialogue on statecraft, memory, and decay. He claimed the story came from Egyptian priests who remembered civilizations older than Greece by thousands of years. Imagine if the library preserved those records. Imagine if that knowledge traced patterns, not of geography, but of rise and fall. Civilizations reaching peaks of insight, then crumbling under their own blindness. Perhaps we do not want that mirror. Perhaps we needed Alexandria to vanish. There is irony in that erasure. For in destroying the record, we immortalized the mystery. And now, centuries later, in the faintest outlines of forgotten texts, we begin to see the ghost of what was lost. A geometry of knowing that was not hierarchical, but circular. A medicine that healed soul and sinew alike. A physics not of particles, but of resonance. Not superstition, but another framework. One we discarded not because it failed, but because it conflicted. And now we are left to guess. To sit quietly at the edge of a vast unlit archive and feel for the contours of truth with only echoes to guide us. How many revolutions of thought began there and ended before they could rise? And who, across centuries, benefited from our forgetting? The mind resists the idea that some knowledge can vanish. It clings to the belief that wisdom, once known, leaves traces, citations, carvings, whispers in the margins of other books. But what happens when the entire web of context is burned? When the scaffolding of understanding is dismantled piece by piece, and all that remains are names without meaning, diagrams without labels, formulas missing their axioms? How many ideas have we stumbled upon, thinking them new, when in truth they are echoes? Echoes of scrolls now silent. It's not only the texts themselves that were lost in Alexandria. It was the conversations, the mentorships between thinkers, the fragile synthesis of cross-cultural debate, the wild hypotheses no one thought to write down because they were spoken by torchlight in stone-walled halls, shared only among a few initiates and never repeated. How do you catalog a worldview when its grammar is gone? And if that worldview challenged the very architecture of empire, how quickly would silence follow? There is an unease among scholars when they approach this void. Some try to minimize it, suggesting that much of what was stored in the library was duplicated elsewhere, or that its loss, while tragic, has been overstated. But even these voices betray a discomfort. Because to admit what might truly have been lost is to gaze into a chasm that defies recovery. The loss is not only historical, it is metaphysical. The library did not merely house facts, it held frameworks, ways of seeing that no longer exist. Concepts so foreign to our modern taxonomy that we lack the words to describe them now, and so we relegate them to mysticism, pseudoscience, myth. Labels used less to describe than to dismiss. But every myth is a veil, and some veils were never meant to be lifted by accident. Take, for example, the idea that sound could move stone. It appears, briefly, in the work of the Greek traveler Iamblichus, who recorded Egyptian priests chanting in certain pitches that altered matter. It emerges again in scattered Tibetan legends and in the notes of Nikola Tesla, who spoke cryptically of frequencies as the keys to the universe. Could scrolls in the library have explored resonance as a force, not just in music, but in physics? And what would that mean for how we understand energy, architecture, even consciousness? Or consider the ancient concept of know as a universal mind, not a deity, but a field of awareness in which human thought participates. This idea surfaces in Neoplatonism, in Vedic philosophy, in early Christian mysticism. It suggests that intelligence is not housed solely in the brain, but flows through all things. That to know something truly is not to analyze it, but to become momentarily one with it. Such a notion is heresy to the mechanistic view of the world. It dissolves the distinction between subject and object, between knower and known. And it invites the terrifying possibility that our ancestors may have grasped something we have since forgotten, not because it was disproven, but because it could not be measured with tools forged in a narrower age. What happens when a civilization no longer has the language for its own past? We build museums to protect artifacts, but rarely do we preserve ways of seeing. And those are the first to die. Not with fire, but with neglect. Imagine the scrolls of the library not as inert pages, but as living thresholds. Some may have contained methods, rituals of observation, meditation, integration. Not religious rites, but protocols of perception. Ways to train the mind to see patterns, to feel into symbols, to hear the harmonies between disciplines. Philosophy as yoga, geometry as prayer, astronomy as self-knowledge. Such a synthesis has no place in a divided world. We prefer silos. Physics in one box, poetry in another, medicine here, myth there. But in Alexandria, those boxes were not yet built. The distinctions had not ossified. And so thinkers were free to drift between disciplines, to let metaphors evolve into models, to test the spiritual by the scientific without shame. And that was dangerous, because a mind that sees unity cannot be governed in the same way. A person who senses the divine in number and form does not fear doctrine. And an archive that houses every voice leaves no room for a single authority. Perhaps that was the real threat. Not what the library contained, but what it allowed. It allowed multiplicity, and multiplicity is ungovernable. To this day, we reconstruct Alexandria through fragments, lists of titles from secondary sources, quotations in later works, occasional references in Arabic commentaries that preserve ghostly outlines of books we'll never hold. It's like trying to rebuild a cathedral from grains of sand. And yet, sometimes a fragment is enough to awaken something. There are words that linger in the silence. Kenosis, the emptying of the self to receive the divine. Logos, the word that is more than speech, the pattern behind patterns. Anamnesis, the remembering of things the soul already knows. These words passed through Alexandria. They shimmered in its corridors, echoed in its stone. And though the scrolls may be gone, the ideas flicker still. But perhaps we misunderstand the loss. Perhaps the library did not vanish all at once. Perhaps it is still vanishing. Each time we forget how to listen. Each time we choose certainty over wonder. Each time we reject the old in favor of the merely new. Because forgetting is not only an event, it is a process. And like erosion, it can happen quietly, beneath the surface, until one day the ground gives way, and we wonder where the foundation went. So tonight, As you lie in the stillness between waking and sleep, consider what Alexandria truly was. Not just a building, not just a library, but a mirror. A mirror we were not ready to look into. A mirror some chose to shatter. But shards remain, and if you gather them carefully, you may begin to see a shape, something ancient, something unfinished, something waiting to be remembered. Some knowledge survives not in books, but in blood, passed not through libraries, but through lineage, not stored in ink, but in ritual, in repetition, in the subtle cadence of a chant. There are truths too volatile to be entrusted to parchment, too sacred to leave out in the open. Truths that are carried from teacher to student, whispered in cloistered halls, guarded by silence. And perhaps some of those truths were once housed in Alexandria. But perhaps others were deliberately kept out. Not all knowledge was meant to be catalogued. Not all wisdom wanted to be found. The scholars of the library did not merely collect, they interpreted, they organized, they translated. In doing so, they also decided what was worthy of inclusion and what remained unsaid. For every scroll acquired, there were others dismissed. For every theory preserved, countless were misunderstood or ignored. And this is where the shadow falls deepest. What if the most powerful knowledge, cosmologies, energy systems, understandings of the self, was never fully recorded in the first place? Or worse, what if it was recorded, but then erased deliberately once its implications became clear? Consider the mysterious teachings of the mystery schools, initiatory systems in Egypt, Greece, and the Near East, said to offer direct experience of the divine. Some say these schools held maps of the psyche long before Freud, insights into symbolic language, archetypes, the death-rebirth cycle of the soul. Fragments survive in the form of the Orphic hymns, the Hermetica, and Plato's own allusions to the Eleusinian mysteries. But none of these are complete. None reveal the actual process. Only the echoes remain. Could it be that Alexandria held the full versions? Could it be that initiates once transcribed the teachings, hidden in cipher, wrapped in allegory, and that those texts were among the first to vanish? If so, their removal would not be random. It would be surgical, because systems of direct knowing threaten systems of control. A person who has tasted gnosis, unmediated awareness, no longer needs an intermediary, no priest, no ruler, no sanctioned narrative. And that is unacceptable to empires. Even today, there are traces of this discomfort. Psychology remains separated from spirituality, religion from science, myth from medicine. But once, perhaps, they were all fingers of the same hand, the same whole, seen from different angles. And maybe that is what Alexandria once preserved. Not just knowledge, but integration. A worldview in which mind, matter, and mystery were not enemies, but collaborators. But such unity cannot last in a world governed by segmentation. So we break it, we reduce, we name, we divide the sacred into parts, and forget how they once sang together. And then we forget that we forgot. In the centuries following the library's decline, the world entered what we now call the Dark Ages, a time of scarcity, not only of food or stability, but of vision. The great centers of learning were abandoned or repurposed. Inquiry gave way to orthodoxy. Books were copied by hand, slowly, with countless errors. Some texts were altered, others disappeared entirely. Monasteries became the new libraries, but they chose what to transcribe. Pagan philosophy was often suspect. Writings that challenged theological authority were quietly omitted. The heretic's flame was not metaphor, it was real. And still, some things endured. The Arab world, in particular, became a vessel for memory. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. They preserved ideas that would later return to Europe in a strange echo of their origin. Aristotle rediscovered in Spain, Ptolemy filtered through Damascus. Some even claim that Arabic copies of Alexandrian scrolls may still lie hidden in private collections, untouched, untranslated, sealed away by families who no longer read the languages their ancestors once knew. If so, what do those vaults hold? What keys sleep behind locked doors? It's tempting to imagine some grand revelation, an undiscovered manuscript, an ancient map, a text that redraws the boundaries of history. But perhaps the deeper secret is not in a single book, but in a way of knowing we no longer practice, a kind of reading that is not literal but symbolic, not quick but contemplative, a reading that doesn't seek to extract but to commune. What if the real treasure of the library wasn't its content, but its approach? A method of engaging knowledge that treated it as sacred, living, incomplete. A method that asked more than it answered, that allowed room for paradox, mystery, and transformation. In such a method, silence is not a lack. It is a presence. And perhaps that is why so many scrolls disappeared. Not because their words were too explicit, but because they pointed toward experiences that could not be confined to text. There are stories, difficult to verify, but persistent, of scrolls that sang when opened, not literally, but through the resonance of their ideas, texts that changed the reader, not by instruction, but by invitation. These stories sound strange to modern ears, trained on data and summary. But to the ancients, the border between language and incantation was thin. To name a thing was to shape it. To read a sacred text was not to acquire information. It was to enter a space, a ritual, a transformation. Alexandria may have been a sanctuary for such experiences, and that is what made it dangerous. Because when a person begins to awaken to knowledge as a path, not a product, they become unpredictable. They step out of the rhythms of control. They listen to inner authorities. They begin to question not just the answers, but the questions themselves. And so, perhaps, it was not the content that had to be erased, but the context, the web, the worldview, the sacred regard for learning itself. Because if you can sever the roots, the tree will fall in time. And if you can convince the world that the tree never existed, then even the roots will disappear into the soil of forgetting. But some memories do not die. They linger in symbols, in dreams, in strange, persistent myths that do not fade. They cling to stonework, to ruins, to half-remembered rituals and lullabies. And sometimes, if you listen just before sleep, you can feel them stirring, like embers beneath ash, waiting to be found again, waiting, not to be taught, but to be remembered. Time is not always what it seems. We are taught to see it as a straight line, clean, incremental, reliable. A river flowing in one direction, with cause and effect marching obediently from the past into the present. But ancient cultures rarely saw it this way. They spoke of cycles, of returns, of golden ages forgotten and rediscovered like breath in the lungs of history. And perhaps, in the heart of Alexandria, there were scrolls that charted a very different kind of time. Time that looped, time that cracked, time that remembered. What if the greatest loss was not of individual texts, but of an entire chronology? We base our understanding of history on sequences. Who came first? What invention followed what? Which empire rose and when? But even these anchors are fragile. The burning of one archive, the loss of a few key manuscripts, the mistranslation of a calendar system, and suddenly, centuries tilt out of alignment. What once was a clear path becomes a hall of mirrors. And perhaps that was the plan. There are theories, often dismissed but never disproven, that suggest our current historical timeline is an illusion. That the chronology we rely on today, built largely during the Renaissance, was assembled with gaps and guesses, corrected by politics, and cemented by consensus rather than certainty. Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko proposed that large parts of ancient history were duplicated under different names, that the same events were retold in different centuries, that what we call ancient Rome may in some strange way be a mirror of medieval Europe, told twice in different clothes. His claims are controversial, and many academics reject them outright. But the deeper question he raised, how do we know what we think we know, remains. And when one considers the erasure of the Library of Alexandria, that question becomes more urgent. Because the library wasn't merely a storehouse of books, it was a node, a hub connecting texts across continents and eras. Its archivists were cross-referencing Egyptian dynasties with Babylonian kings lists, aligning Greek myths with Indian astronomical records, tracing linguistic threads that hinted at a shared prehistoric source. What if, within those comparisons, a deeper truth was emerging? What if the scholars of Alexandria had begun to uncover inconsistencies in the story of time itself? Evidence that humanity's past did not move in a straight line, but surged and collapsed in waves. There are ruins, megalithic, unexplained, that refuse to fit our timeline. Massive stone structures in Peru, Bolivia, Turkey, that display techniques of construction we cannot replicate today. Some of these sites appear to predate written language by millennia, and yet they show signs of advanced knowledge, geometry, astronomy, and seismic design far beyond what we attribute to those eras. Göbekli Tepe, unearthed in the 1990s, is perhaps the most famous of these. Dated to nearly 12,000 years ago, it rewrote the story of civilization overnight. Before its discovery, we were taught that agriculture led to cities, and then to religion and art. But Göbekli Tepe was a ceremonial complex, possibly a temple, built by people who had no cities, no agriculture, only intention. It suggests that spiritual insight came first. And if that is true, what else might be true? What if ancient civilizations rose and fell long before the ones we study in school? What if Alexandria's scrolls contained references to those lost epochs, not as myths, but as memories? We are told that history is young, that human civilization began just a few thousand years ago, that anything older is speculation. But this neat package of time depends on fragile sources, a few inscriptions, a few layers of sediment, and the assumption that we already know what's possible. Alexandria may have challenged that assumption. Its scholars studied the flood myths of every culture, not as fairy tales, but as encoded records. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Atlantis, the Deucalion flood in Greek tradition, the Manu story from India, the biblical deluge, all share eerie similarities. A sudden flood, a loss of civilization, a few survivors, a beginning again. Is it coincidence, or is it memory? What if these stories all point to the same event, an actual cataclysm, not merely physical, but cultural? one that wiped the slate clean and forced humanity to begin again, carrying only fragments of what came before? And what if the library preserved those fragments? Imagine a scroll describing how to align architecture with the Earth's magnetic fields. Another showing stellar maps that accounted for the precession of the equinoxes over tens of thousands of years. Another still detailing the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations based not on politics or war, but on energy patterns, solar, lunar, cosmic. Such scrolls would not just challenge history, they would challenge power. Because when time is uncertain, authority becomes unstable. If people begin to believe that history is not fixed, then perhaps truth is not handed down, but rediscovered. Perhaps knowledge is not inherited, but awakened, and those in power cannot afford that. To control history is to control identity, and to question the timeline is to question the entire structure built upon it. Maybe that is why so much effort has gone into maintaining a singular narrative, one origin, one path, one interpretation of the past. But Alexandria, before its silencing, may have hinted at another story, one in which time breathes, in which civilizations pulse like tides, in which the past is not behind us, but beneath us, waiting to rise again. There are places where the soil itself seems to hum, where ruins still speak, though no one hears, where myths refuse to die. And sometimes a question rises, not from books, but from bone. What if we are older than we think? What if the forgetting was not accidental, but cyclical? What if we are not the first to seek the stars, nor the last to fall from them? In the silence after Alexandria, the timeline hardened. The official story set like stone, but stone too can crack, and through those cracks, something stirs, a different rhythm, a different scale, a memory not yet fully gone. Listen carefully. It may be time to remember, not just what was lost, but when. Words are not merely symbols, they are vessels. They carry more than meaning. They carry memory, intonation, rhythm, shape. A word spoken in an ancient tongue is not just a sound, it is a map, a ritual, a fingerprint of a worldview that no longer exists. And when a language dies, it doesn't go quietly. It takes with it entire systems of thought that cannot be translated. Perhaps that's why so many scrolls from the Library of Alexandria were never copied. Not because no one cared, but because no one could. We often imagine knowledge as something static, transferable, extractable, easily preserved. But some knowledge cannot survive outside the language that birthed it. A concept in Sumerian may have no Greek equivalent. An idea in Sanskrit might collapse under Latin grammar. Translation is not just difficult, it is distortion. And sometimes it is erasure. Alexandria stood at the intersection of tongues, Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, even early Arabic dialects. Its scholars were linguists, interpreters, alchemists of meaning. They didn't just read texts, they deciphered them, compared them, layered them. And in doing so, they unearthed something most civilizations never dare admit: that different languages do not describe the same world. They shape different worlds. And some worlds were not meant to survive the age of empires. There are whispers, little more than footnotes in forgotten scholarship, that some scrolls in the library were written in now-dead languages, proto-languages, older than Phoenician, scripts no one could trace, glyphs etched into papyrus in spirals, in waveforms, in patterns that resembled star charts more than sentences. Some scholars believe these were remnants of pre-cataclysmic civilizations. Others dismiss them as frauds or fantasies. But the question remains, what if these texts were never meant to be read, but heard? What if sound itself was a component of the message? Ancient Egyptian temples were built with acoustics in mind. The temple of Hathor at Dendera echoes in strange harmonics. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid resonates at specific frequencies when tones are chanted within it. Could the scrolls of Alexandria have documented such phenomena? Could they have held phonetic instructions, mantras, tonal sequences, vibratory languages that acted not as metaphors, but mechanisms? There is evidence, too subtle for most textbooks, that language once had a more fluid role in cognition. In early Indo-European tongues, nouns were not static entities. They were alive, changing depending on position, intent, even emotional tone. In many ancient cultures, to speak was to act. Words were not about things, they were things. And maybe that was the real threat. Because a world where language creates reality cannot be ruled in the same way. A language that encodes reciprocity, reverence, and relational time does not serve a system built on separation, on linear progress, on control. If Alexandria housed texts in such languages, if it preserved the blueprints of communication that did more than inform, then its destruction becomes more than political. It becomes metaphysical. A silencing not of ideas, but of realities. Even now we struggle with remnants, words that seem untranslatable, slippery, oddly resilient. The Egyptian Ma'at, meaning truth, justice, harmony, cosmic order, all at once. The Greek logos, a word, a reason, a pattern. The Sanskrit RTA, the natural flow of the universe. These are not just definitions, they are invitations, doors to a different way of perceiving. And perhaps someone wanted those doors shut, not destroyed, just forgotten. Because true forgetting is never violent, it is quiet, it is gradual. It happens when the words fade from mouths, when chants are no longer passed from mother to child, when the shape of meaning dissolves beneath the surface of a new language that does not know how to hold it. And so we are left with translations, half-memories, footnotes that hint at something larger. Take, for example, the mysterious language of the birds, a legendary tongue said to underlie all others. It appears in Sufi poetry, in Kabbalistic mysticism, in alchemical texts preserved during the Islamic Golden Age. It was said to be a language of pure vibration, understood by the soul, not the intellect. Could the library have contained references to it? Could it be that such a language, if it ever existed, was not mystical fiction, but the echo of a real, ancient method of sonic knowledge? Consider, too, the Tower of Babel, not just as a myth of pride and punishment, but as a metaphor for the fragmentation of understanding. A moment when unity of speech was broken, and with it, a unity of mind. Was the Library of Alexandria a brief reversal of that curse? A moment when the tongues of many came together and the memory of a unified knowing stirred again? And if so, what forces would be threatened by such reunion? Empires thrive on division. The more fragmented the languages, the easier it is to govern, to limit, to define. A single archive that transcends dialects, belief systems, and geography, such as Alexandria, does not just preserve knowledge, it erodes borders. And perhaps that was intolerable. So the tongues fell silent, not all at once, not dramatically, but word by word, term by term, until the last scholar died, the last scroll decayed, the last language drifted into myth, and we were left with translations, with meanings that no longer meant, But sometimes something stirs. In dreams, in music, in poetry written in a language we do not yet remember learning, a chord that resonates somewhere older than the mind, a phrase that makes no sense yet brings tears, a word that is more than a word. Perhaps that's how the library speaks now, not in volumes, but in echoes. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, not with your ears, but with the quiet center behind your thoughts, you will begin to remember the tongue of knowing, not to speak it, just to feel its rhythm again, just enough to know. It was real, and it was not lost, only sleeping. A library is not merely a building, it is a body, each scroll a bone, each shelf a rib, each chamber a lung holding the breath of ancient minds. To burn a library is to dismember memory, to violate something sacred. And if the Library of Alexandria was the greatest temple of thought the world has ever known, then what was its destruction, if not a kind of ritual murder? We rarely ask what it means to destroy knowledge, not in terms of loss, but in terms of intention. Is it simply an accident of war? A side effect of conquest? Or is there something deeper, a kind of sacrilege wrapped in strategy? A recognition, perhaps even fear, that certain knowledge carries a power not meant for public light? If we speak of the library not as a storehouse, but as a living entity, then we must also consider the possibility that its death was not collateral. It was execution. And for that to occur, someone, or something, had to fear what it contained. The scrolls of Alexandria were not bound by one system of thought. They were chaotic, contradictory, alive, pagan hymns beside early Christian tracts, Chaldean star charts beside Indian medical texts. The blueprints of rival cosmologies sitting quietly together, not yet forced to choose sides. It was a pluralism that unsettled authority, because when all truths are present, no single truth can rule. There are accounts, muted, fragmented, of scrolls that questioned the foundations of empire, treatises on cyclical governance, warnings about the consolidation of spiritual power, philosophical models that promoted decentralization, cooperation, the dissolution of hierarchy, not as a rebellion, but as nature. The Tao flows not in lines, but in curves. The Dharma wheel turns. Even the Egyptian Ma'at is not a throne. It is balance. And perhaps the library was one of the last places where those principles still whispered across cultures before empire hardened into dogma. So imagine, for a moment, that knowledge was not neutral. Imagine that knowledge was sacred, that each scroll, each idea, each language held not just information, but presence, a kind of subtle spirit, not conscious like a person, but alive like a flame, flickering, fragile, and that the library was a temple where these flames were tended, kept from wind and corruption. Then the burning becomes not just destruction, it becomes desecration. And the silence that followed, generations of ignorance, of isolation, of separation from the past, was not merely darkness, it was exile. An exile from the sacred, from a way of knowing that did not divide body from spirit, matter from meaning, science from song. The priests of Alexandria were not called priests. They were scribes, philosophers, mystics, translators, but their work was ritual, to preserve, to connect, to illuminate, and in a world obsessed with order, with purity, with absolutes. Such illumination was dangerous, because light reveals not only beauty, but contradictions, and contradictions cannot serve conquest. So we built new temples, cathedrals of certainty, fortresses of doctrine, academies of reason stripped of myth, and slowly, The idea of the sacred library was replaced by the secular archive. The soul was traded for the system. And yet, not entirely. Even now there is something sacred about a library. The hush, the weight of the air, the way your footsteps soften as you pass between shelves, as if the walls themselves are listening. The way certain books seem to shimmer before you touch them, as if choosing you, not the other way around. What if that atmosphere is not mere imagination? What if it is a memory, not yours, not mine, but a deeper memory, the memory of the temple that once was, the memory of Alexandria, because places leave echoes, even when their walls fall, even when the books are ash. The idea remains, the reverence lingers, and perhaps that is what truly endures. Not the scrolls, but the impulse to preserve, to gather, to protect that which transcends any one culture, any one god, any one age. That impulse is sacred, and that is why it continues. In hidden corners of the world, there are still libraries built like sanctuaries. The Biblioteca Malatestiana in Italy, the monasteries of Mount Athos, the ancient stone shelves of Timbuktu. In these places, books are not simply read. They are kept, guarded, honored, and somewhere in that act, Alexandria breathes again. But there is more. Because if we see knowledge as sacred, then its destruction carries karmic weight. And the fall of Alexandria may not have been the end. It may have been a turning point, a sacrifice, a veil drawn across the face of wisdom, not forever, but for a season. In myth, the sacred is often hidden, not lost. Osiris dismembered, Dionysus torn apart, the phoenix consumed by flame. And always, always there is rebirth, a recombination, a return. So perhaps the library too follows this cycle. Perhaps the knowledge never vanished, perhaps it scattered into fragments, into dreams, into the subconscious of civilization. And perhaps we are now slowly, painfully gathering the pieces. One scroll here, one symbol there, one untranslatable word that refuses to die, not to recreate what was, but to remember what it meant. That knowledge is not power, it is prayer. It is the breath between the stars, the whisper behind the words, the presence that watches even now as we try to find our way back. Not to Alexandria, but to the temple within, the one we burned, and the one that still waits. There is a strange paradox in the human relationship with truth. We claim to seek it. We build institutions in its name. We wage wars to protect it. We shape entire civilizations around its pursuit. And yet, when truth grows too wild, too complex, too unwieldy for the structures we've built, we retreat. Or worse, we bury it. And so we return again to the Library of Alexandria, not just as a symbol of lost knowledge, but as a gate, a threshold that once opened into a reality we were perhaps not ready to face. What was hidden? Not forgotten, not misfiled, not lost by accident, but hidden. Secrecy, after all, is not chaos. It is strategy. It is choice. It is the careful act of withholding, not to protect knowledge from time, but to protect time from the knowledge. And throughout history, secrecy has been the companion of power. In Alexandria, the scholars who worked in the shadows of scroll-laden halls were not always free. Their work, though revered, was subject to oversight, patronage, political tides, religious scrutiny. The Ptolemaic kings, for all their fascination with knowledge, still ruled. The priesthood still guarded the temples. The Roman governors still watched. So what happens when a scribe deciphers something he cannot share? When a scroll reveals more than the ruling order can tolerate? The existence of restricted texts is not new. Even today, classified knowledge shapes the modern world. In military research, corporate archives, sealed Vatican vaults, truths remain hidden not because they are false, but because they are volatile. And if today's world guards its secrets with such rigor, what of antiquity? What of a library that held not just histories, but formulas, not just theories, but systems of transformation? It is believed that certain chambers of the library were off-limits to all but the highest scholars, texts written in codes, symbols, or languages no longer spoken aloud. These were not meant for the public, perhaps not even for posterity. Some may have held teachings on transformation, not metaphorical, but internal. Consciousness-shifting rituals, practices that restructured the psyche, the body, or both. We find hints of these in the mystery schools, in hermetic fragments, in Gnostic visions that speak of ascending through layers of perception. Were these teachings ever written down? And if so, were they removed, suppressed, or quietly copied and hidden away, preserved not for the empire, but for those yet to awaken? There is a pattern repeating across time of knowledge that emerges only to vanish. The Corpus Hermeticum, rediscovered in the Renaissance, was already a faint echo of earlier, lost teachings. The Nag Hammadi texts, unearthed in Egypt in 1945, sat hidden for nearly 1,600 years, sealed in clay jars. Within them were gospels that painted an entirely different portrait of the divine, not as a distant judge, but as an inner light, not as a ruler, but a reflection. These texts weren't destroyed because they were false. They were hidden because they were dangerous. Dangerous to the idea that truth must come from without, that power must be centralized, that awakening must be managed. And so we must ask, did Alexandria fall because of what it failed to preserve, or because of what it preserved too well? Did it touch a level of synthesis that revealed too much, that showed too clearly the illusion of separation? A knowledge that said, matter is not dead, but dreaming, that the stars above are not just spheres of fire, but mirrors, that every being holds within it a spark of the whole, that the divine is not an object to be worshipped, but a pattern to be remembered. These are not new ideas. They echo through Sufi poetry, through Eastern philosophies, through the mystical strands of nearly every tradition. But when centralized power meets the decentralizing force of inner gnosis, conflict is inevitable. And so the erasure begins, not all at once, but piece by piece. First, the scrolls that challenge official timelines, then the texts that speak in riddles rather than laws, then the voices, like Hypatia, who embody wisdom without permission. And finally, the silence, the long forgetting. But secrets do not vanish. They seed themselves, sometimes in symbols, sometimes in story, sometimes in the architecture of ruins that refuse to yield their purpose. There are temples in Egypt, carved with images that seem to depict technology, light bulbs, flying discs, devices that hum with resonance. Scholars dismiss them as misinterpretations. But what if they are not? What if Alexandria once held the keys to understanding these symbols, not as fantasy, but as metaphorical blueprints? A way of translating sacred imagery into physics, into inner alchemy? And then there are the artifacts, those few scrolls that escaped, translated into Arabic, stored in obscure libraries, later whispered through the works of Avicenna, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Islamic scholars who kept the flame alive, even as Europe slept. What did they preserve? And what did they choose not to reveal? In every age, there are guardians, not of facts, but of thresholds. Men and women who understand that knowledge is not merely accumulation, it is a passage, a shift in perception, a shedding of the skin of certainty. And in this, perhaps, Alexandria was not destroyed. Perhaps it was veiled, made invisible until the eyes of the world were ready, if they ever will be. And so we live in a paradox. We seek the truth, but we build walls around it. We archive, classify, encrypt, and we call it protection. But what we protect, we also entomb. And what we entomb, we forget. So maybe the question is not, what was hidden in the Library of Alexandria? Maybe it's this. Why do we continue to hide it from ourselves? Some truths are not written. They are built, etched into stone, stretched across pillars, hidden in proportion and shape. There are ideas so subtle, so expansive, that language fails them. And when words falter, form takes over. Geometry becomes grammar. Architecture becomes scripture. And perhaps the Library of Alexandria was once the key to reading that silent script. The scholars of Alexandria did more than read and translate. They studied the structure of meaning itself. They understood that numbers were not just quantities, they were qualities, archetypes. They knew that the circle was not only a shape, but a symbol of wholeness, that the triangle, the square, the spiral, all carried embedded wisdom older than myth. We forget that math was once mysticism, that geometry was once a doorway, and perhaps within the library there were scrolls that unlocked what we now dismiss as aesthetic, proportions of sacred space, alignments of temples with stars, ratios encoded not just in buildings, but in breath, in music, in the rhythm of thought itself, sacred geometry. It appears across cultures with eerie consistency, the golden ratio found in the Parthenon and in the petals of flowers, the Vesica Piscis mirrored in Gothic cathedrals and Egyptian reliefs, the flower of life etched into granite at Abydos. None of these symbols are explained fully in surviving texts. We see them, we measure them, but we do not understand their original function. What if Alexandria once held the Rosetta Stone, not of language, but of pattern, a way of decoding form as knowledge? Pythagoras, who predated the library but influenced its lineage, taught that the universe was built from harmony, that everything, planets, bodies, thoughts, vibrated in mathematically precise relationships. Later, Neoplatonists in Alexandria would echo this vision, speaking of reality as a great unfolding of the one into the many, a process marked by ratio, proportion, and reflection. The body was a temple, the temple was a cosmos, and each followed the same invisible architecture. But somewhere along the way, this idea faded. We began to see geometry as neutral, as technical. We teach it in classrooms stripped of its symbolic core. And in doing so, we forget that the shapes around us once spoke, not in metaphor, but in resonance. And what does that have to do with the library? Everything. Because if knowledge was encoded in structure, then scrolls were only one form of record. The library may have been part of a larger system, aligned with other sacred sites, connected through ley lines, designed not just to store information but to amplify it, to enact it, to generate insight through space itself. What if the architecture of Alexandria held secrets we never thought to look for? There are suggestions, half glimpsed in later Islamic and European accounts, that the layout of the library was designed according to Pythagorean harmonics, that certain chambers were tuned to specific frequencies, that the building itself participated in the act of knowing. It may sound far-fetched, but the ancients did not separate space from experience. To enter a temple was to shift one's state of consciousness. To walk its axis was to journey through myth. The Egyptian temples of Philae, Edfu, and Dendera all reflect this logic. Narrow passageways into widening sanctuaries, hidden chambers bathed in controlled light, ceiling carvings of the zodiac, tracking not only time, but perception. And Alexandria stood at the crossroads of all this wisdom. If its scrolls explained how to read architecture as language, then its destruction did more than burn paper. It broke the link between mind and matter. It severed the ritual of place. And so even when we visit the ruins of ancient structures, we stand outside their meaning. We look, but we no longer enter. The knowledge remains, but without the key, it stays silent, and so we rebuild. But what we build no longer speaks. Glass towers, featureless walls, cities that hum not with harmony, but with dissonance. And we wonder why our minds feel fractured, why our attention splinters, why so many feel disconnected from something they can't quite name. Perhaps it is the geometry that's gone. Perhaps we no longer live inside forms that nourish understanding. And perhaps the library once taught us how to shape those forms. There's a phrase, almost lost to time, ars memoriae, the art of memory. In the classical world, knowledge was not memorized through repetition, but through architecture. The mind would walk an imaginary palace. Each room held an image. Each image, a concept. The order of the rooms created the logic. The structure held the insight. It was not just a technique. It was a worldview. To know was to place. To remember was to walk. What if the library was the world's greatest memory palace, not metaphorically, but literally? A physical manifestation of insight. And what if its destruction did not only erase texts, but disoriented memory itself? What if, in tearing down the shape of knowledge, we also forgot how to know? Even now, fragments return. Architects rediscover the golden ratio. Physicists stumble onto sacred symmetries. Artists channel patterns older than history. But without context, these discoveries float, disconnected from their original purpose. And so we must ask, what would it mean to rebuild not just the library, but the understanding of form it preserved, not in bricks and mortar, but in consciousness? To see again with the eye that perceives pattern, to walk again through space as if it speaks, to remember that knowledge is not just written, it is drawn, it is carved, it is lived. And somewhere beneath the ashes of Alexandria, the blueprint remains, waiting not for construction, but for recognition, waiting for us to read the silence between shapes, and to see, finally, that the scrolls we burned were never only on paper, they were always around us. Somewhere in the dark, a wheel turns, not the kind bound to spokes or roads, but one carved in silence, one made of stars. Long before we tracked time with clocks, we measured it by the sky. The rise of Sirius, the drift of Orion, the slow tilt of the heavens across lifetimes. To the ancients, the cosmos was not a backdrop. It was a language. And for those who listened carefully enough, it spoke. The Library of Alexandria was not only a vault of books, it was a nexus, a node in a global tradition that saw knowledge as cosmic, as celestial, and among its most precious scrolls, it is said, were star maps. But not the kind we recognize today. These were not simply charts of constellations. They were records of movement, of rhythm, of the great clock behind all things, the precession of the equinoxes, the wobble of Earth's axis, the slow shifting of the sky's great wheel over millennia. This motion, nearly imperceptible to a single lifetime, was tracked by civilizations far older than we once believed. The builders of ancient observatories in Nabta Playa, Chanquillo, and Malta all aligned stone with star. Not casually, precisely, patiently. And perhaps the scribes of Alexandria gathered these alignments, compared them, charted the deeper pattern that connected culture to cosmos. What if the library held not only maps of the stars, but of the soul's journey through them? To modern ears, this sounds poetic, but to the ancients, it was practical. Spiritual insight was woven into astronomy. Time itself was sacred, and epochs were not measured merely in years, but in ages of consciousness. The Greeks called them the Great Ages: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The Hindus spoke of the yugas. The Mayans tracked the Baktun. These systems, though separated by ocean and language, all shared a curious trait. They saw history as cyclical, not progressing, but returning. Decline was not the end. It was part of the curve, and rebirth was always encoded in the fall. Perhaps that's what Alexandria preserved. A record of the wheels turning, of civilizations rising and falling not by accident but in rhythm, echoes of earlier cycles. Memories of ages lost not to chance, but to gravity. If such maps existed, maps that revealed our place not just on the earth, but in time, what might they have shown? That we are not the pinnacle, that what we call ancient was once modern, that our future may already be written in the stars we've forgotten how to read. Among the scrolls rumored to be lost were texts ascribed to ancient priests of Heliopolis, Babylonian astronomers, Chaldean stargazers. Texts that described sky temples, planetary harmonics, the alignment of monuments not just for ceremony, but for contact. With what, they did not say. Were these myths, or were they observations, misread as metaphor? The Dendera zodiac, carved into an Egyptian temple ceiling and now held in the Louvre, shows a sky full of movement, planets, deacons, celestial boats. It suggests a sophistication of astronomical knowledge that scholars still debate. Some believe it points to specific dates, moments of great transition, long before the library's fall. And the question emerges, what if those dates were warnings, markers, gateways, or resets? We like to imagine that history began with writing. But what if writing was a rediscovery, a response to amnesia? What if the stars were the original texts, and the library was an attempt to bind their meaning into scrolls, to save what the sky once taught before the memory slipped away? We find, in myths from every corner of the globe, stories of beings descending from the stars, not as science fiction, but as ancestors, guides, teachers of farming, of geometry, of music. In Sumerian tablets, they are the Apkallu. In Dogon tradition, the Nomo. In Egypt, Thoth. Always luminous, always connected to the heavens. What if the library preserved their stories not as myth, but as lineage? What if it held star genealogies, charts that mapped not just physical constellations, but the evolution of consciousness through darkness and light, forgetting and awakening? In modern cosmology, we are just beginning to grasp that space is not silent, that gravitational waves ripple through it, that cosmic background radiation still hums from a beginning we barely understand. But the ancients may have known this in their own way. And perhaps the library was their amplifier, a place where resonances were compared, where astrologers did not predict personality traits, but read the collective mood of epochs, where astronomers and philosophers debated not only how the heavens moved, but what those movements meant. And in that meaning, perhaps, was the seed of danger. Because when you begin to see yourself as a node in a cosmic rhythm, empire loses its grip, identity expands, time stretches, death becomes a doorway, and power shifts inward. A civilization grounded in cosmic awareness does not serve the same masters, it does not fear in the same way, and it cannot be ruled by force alone. And so, if the library held such star maps, then its destruction was not merely the loss of astronomy, it was the shattering of orientation, the compass gone, the wheel forgotten, and yet the sky remains. We still walk beneath it, still see the same stars, still feel, if we are quiet enough, the pull of something older than language. In ancient times, initiation often involved a night under the open sky, to lie in silence, to observe, to wait, not for signs, but for resonance. Perhaps that is what the library invited, not just study, but communion. And perhaps that is what we must now recover, not just the data, but the gaze, the slow turning of thought to match the sky's pace, to remember that knowledge was once a rhythm, a cycle, a spiral, and that we are still within it, even now, even here, even in the silence. The body remembers what the mind forgets, even after the scrolls have burned, even after the diagrams are erased, the chants silenced, the formulas buried beneath centuries of dismissal. Somewhere beneath skin and breath and blood, something stirs, a rhythm, a memory, a different way of being. What if the Library of Alexandria once held more than philosophical inquiry and astronomical observation? What if it preserved an entire science of the body? Not as we know it now, dissected, divided, reduced to machinery, but as a continuum, a subtle, resonant system, a field in motion. What if healing was once seen not as correction, but as recalibration? What if medicine began not with symptom and diagnosis, but with alignment? There are stories, thin as parchment, but still surviving, of scrolls translated from ancient Indian texts, fragments of Ayurveda, theories of energy channels, of pulse diagnosis, of herbal remedies tuned not just to the organ, but to the emotion. There are whispers of Egyptian medical papyri detailing procedures, plant knowledge, surgical techniques, and something else, something subtler, something vibrational. We forget that early medicine was not merely physical, it was also poetic, rhythmic, incantatory. To heal was to restore harmony. The word pharmakon in Greek meant both remedy and poison, a reminder that balance, not elimination, was the goal, that the body was not a battlefield, but a temple, one to be listened to, not subdued. And perhaps the library preserved this worldview before it was broken. In the ancient temples of Egypt, healing rituals involved light, sound, and scent, sacred oils, tonal invocations, geometric rooms designed to amplify certain frequencies. Could it be that the scrolls in Alexandria documented these practices? An entire medical system based on resonance, not resistance? We find similar echoes across the world. In traditional Chinese medicine, the meridians. In indigenous American healing, the sweat lodge, the song. In Greek medicine, the four humors. In all of them, the same principle appears: health as flow, illness as stagnation, cure as restoration of movement. But this approach does not serve systems built on intervention. It resists commodification. It is not linear, it is not fast. And so, perhaps, it was set aside, suppressed, or worse, misunderstood. There are early records of energy being studied as a force, not electricity, something subtler, the pneuma of Greek tradition, the chi of Chinese texts, the ka and ba of Egyptian cosmology. These terms do not translate cleanly into modern science, but perhaps that is not their failure. Perhaps it is ours, because in reducing the body to chemistry, we may have amputated half its truth, the half that dreams, the half that remembers. Some claim that the scrolls of Alexandria included diagrams of the body that mapped it more like a landscape than a machine. Channels of flow, points of resonance, symbols that later mirrored the chakra system or the tree of life. Were these models of physiology or metaphors for consciousness embedded in form? What if both? In the Hermetic writings, fragments that survived through Arabic translation and later resurfaced in Renaissance Europe, we are told, as above, so below, as within, so without. A simple phrase, but within it, a profound idea that the body and cosmos mirror each other, that healing the body is a way of harmonizing with the stars, that every organ is not just flesh, but symbol, archetype, gate. And if Alexandria truly preserved this knowledge, then its destruction was not merely cultural loss. It was dismemberment, a fracturing of wholeness, a severing of the soul from the cell. Since then, we have searched, rebuilt, rediscovered fragments, but we rarely integrate them. Acupuncture exists on one side of the hallway, neuroscience on the other. Energy medicine is labeled alternative, while pharmaceuticals dominate the mainstream. And in this division, something vital is lost. Coherence. The sense that the body is not just a site of intervention, but of communion. The sense that illness may carry meaning, not as punishment, but as signal. The sense that healing is not merely recovery, but remembering. There are accounts, scattered but insistent, of sound being used therapeutically in ancient Egypt, that certain temples used chants of specific pitch and rhythm to induce altered states, that priests trained in vocal resonance could shift emotional states, calm the nervous system, even ease pain. Modern science is only now beginning to explore this. The vagus nerve, activated by tone, the entrainment of brain waves, the effect of binaural beats. But these discoveries are treated as innovation. Few realize they may be rediscovery. The library may have known. And if it did, then its fall marks not just the loss of texts, but of embodiment. We began to treat the body as object, as material, as other, and in doing so we forgot that to know oneself was once the highest form of study, that the mysteries were not out there, but in here, in the pulse, in the breath, in the quiet rhythms of a body tuned to something larger. Somewhere in Alexandria, perhaps, there was a room, quiet, round, lit by a single opening to the sky, a chamber where the body was not dissected but listened to, where healers read not just the skin but the aura, not just the eye but the spirit behind it. There are no blueprints for such a room, no diagrams, only the echo, the knowing that something once existed, a bridge between worlds, between form and frequency, between chemistry and consciousness. And though we have no scroll to prove it, the body remembers, in the moments of stillness, in the sensation of being held by music, or breath, or touch, in the deep, strange peace that sometimes comes, not from cure, but from connection. And perhaps, in that moment, we glimpse what Alexandria tried to preserve. Not medicine, but meaning. Not therapy, but resonance. Not the fight against death, but the art of being fully alive. We think of myth as fiction, as old stories for children, colorful but irrelevant, charming but obsolete, dragons and gods and golden apples, tales to be entertained by, not instructed through. But once, myth was the highest form of knowledge. Not because it was literal, but because it held truths too complex for facts. It carried memory across centuries when no scrolls remained. And perhaps this is what the Library of Alexandria understood best: that the most enduring wisdom is not filed, it is felt. The library was not only a haven for science and philosophy, it was also a temple of myth, epic poems, creation stories, flood narratives, hero journeys, sacred plays, all housed under the same roof as mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. To us, these categories feel separate, but to the ancients, they were fingers on the same hand. To preserve myth was not to escape truth. It was to hold it in a different shape. But myth is a fragile thing. It breathes, it shifts, it depends on voice, on memory, on careful transmission. The moment it is treated as mere entertainment, it dies. And when the stories fade, so too does the wisdom encoded in them. The maps of human nature, the patterns of rise and fall, the parables that warned us not of monsters, but of ourselves. Alexandria, it is said, collected these myths from all over the known world, not to flatten them, but to compare, to listen for what resonated across them: floods, trees of life, sacred mountains, dualities of light and shadow, trickster gods, the descent into darkness, and the return bearing fire. Were these symbols mere coincidence, or were they signposts, fragments of a once shared memory, a prehistory spoken in symbols? Perhaps the library did not merely preserve myths. Perhaps it studied them as data, collected across continents, layered and cross-referenced, patterns tracked like constellations, a mythography of humanity. And perhaps it was on the cusp of revealing that myths were not just stories about the past. They were tools. They trained perception, shaped worldview, oriented generations toward moral, emotional, even ecological understanding. And their loss was not just aesthetic, it was disorientation. Consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Mahabharata, the Book of the Dead. These are not primitive fictions. They are vast mirrors of the human condition, drenched in blood, in love, in grief, in glory. They speak to the parts of us not touched by reason alone, and Alexandria held them all, side by side. We do not know what connections its scholars may have drawn. We can only imagine the theories, the insights, the warnings that may have emerged from their studies. But one thing seems clear. Myth was once treated with reverence. It was not beneath science, it was beside it. And maybe that's what made the library dangerous. Because in honoring myth, it honored multiplicity, it embraced ambiguity. And ambiguity is not something empires tolerate easily. An empire needs certainty, a single creation story, a single savior, a single lineage of truth. Myth, true myth, doesn't obey. It doesn't resolve. It dances, it weaves, it contradicts itself, and in doing so, invites the listener to grow beyond dogma. So when the fires came for Alexandria, perhaps they were not just flames of conquest. Perhaps they were flames of consolidation, the narrowing of narrative, the reduction of mystery to morality, of wonder to rule. And so we lost more than stories. We lost our mythic compass. And with it, a sense of place, not in geography but in being. We became literal. And in becoming literal, we forgot how to read ourselves. How to see the serpent not only as a creature, but as a cycle. How to see the hero not only as a person, but as an inner process. How to hear the voice in the dream not as fantasy, but as message. There are whispers that the library contained a catalogue of dreams, not of individuals, but collective symbols, archetypes, visions recorded by mystics, seers, philosophers, a comparative analysis of what humanity saw when it closed its eyes. Can you imagine the patterns that would emerge? The recurrence of towers, of thresholds, of mirrors, of floods. Carl Jung wouldn't walk the earth for another 1,500 years, but perhaps the seeds of his ideas were already there, in the scrolls of Alexandria, the collective unconscious, the archetype, the shadow. Not inventions, remembrances. Myths are not primitive, they are protective. They hold what we cannot yet hold with logic alone. They give form to the formless. And they teach us how to endure, because myth tells us what data cannot, that suffering can be sacred, that endings are never final, that meaning is not discovered, it is made. The story of Alexandria itself has become a myth. It echoes with the same structure, a golden age, a fall, a loss, and the longing to recover what was stolen. Perhaps we keep telling it, not just to mourn the past, but to prepare, to recognize that we are always one fire away from forgetting, and also always one spark away from remembering. Because myth is not static, it regenerates, in art, in dream, in the sudden sense, while walking through a museum or forest, that you are living inside a story older than yourself. Alexandria burned, but the myths it held, some survived, carried in fragments, in song, in lullabies, in symbols carved into stone by hands that never signed their names. And if we listen to those fragments, not to decode, but to feel, we may begin to hear the voice of the library again. Not in certainty, but in suggestion, not in doctrine, but in depth. And perhaps that is how it always intended to speak. Not with answers, but with stories that asked better questions. Somewhere in the shadows of marble halls and cedar shelves, they moved quietly. The scribes, they had no temples, no altars, no marble statues raised in their honor. But without them, no empire, no theology, no science would have lasted more than a breath. They were not rulers, not warriors. They were custodians, and perhaps something more. We picture the Library of Alexandria as scrolls stacked in vaulted rooms under the careful gaze of philosophers and astronomers. But the hands that touched each text, that copied them by oil lamp, that matched one dialect to another, those hands belonged to the invisible ones, the nameless, the preservers, the ones who remembered when others forgot. We rarely speak of them. History forgets those who work in silence. But they were the veins of the library, its memory, its endurance. Without them, the scrolls would have decayed in the desert air. The margins would have remained unread. The symbols would have become shadows. And so, what was it like to be a scribe in Alexandria? To wake before sunrise and begin again. To spend one's life transcribing the same myths in different tongues, translating words older than conquest. To read texts that made the soul tremble, accounts of lost lands, of dream rituals, of laws written in starlight, and to know that most of it would never reach the world outside those walls. There are no diaries, no records of how they thought or felt, only hints, notes left in the margins, tiny corrections, fragments of complaint or wonder or reverence. One anonymous copyist, in the corner of a preserved Greek text, wrote, "The ink fades, but the meaning lingers." Another, "This line is not mine. It came in a dream." They were not just transcribers. They were witnesses. And they bore a strange burden, because some knowledge is heavy, not because it is violent, but because it changes the shape of thought. It rearranges the furniture of belief. And to carry that kind of knowledge in secret, with no promise of release, is a kind of devotion most of us no longer understand. We live now in a world where knowledge is currency, shared, traded, sold. We chase novelty. We want speed, access, visibility. But these scribes lived in a different rhythm. Their work was slow, their audience invisible. Their reward, if any, was the preservation of truth. And so perhaps the question is not why the library fell, but how it lasted as long as it did. How through political shifts, religious pressures, and invasions, the scribes continued to work. Quietly, stubbornly, often against orders, often in fear, because there were always pressures to destroy, to alter, to censor, and some resisted. There were stories, never confirmed, always whispered, of texts hidden before the final fall, buried, smuggled out in carts of grain, copied and disguised. Some say that entire scrolls were rewritten as poetry, as psalms, as riddles, so their meaning could survive under new gods and new laws. We may never know if those stories are true, but if they are, then it was the scribes who became the last librarians, not of books, but of memory. They understood that knowledge cannot survive unless someone loves it enough to carry it, even if it costs them everything. What would that feel like? To hold a scroll that contradicts the entire belief system of your time? To read a sentence that unravels the official calendar, that places the origin of civilization 10,000 years earlier, or names a god that was forbidden? To know, and to be unable to speak. What is the shape of that silence? What is the weight of that knowing? They may not have had words for it, but they had methods. They used allegory. They hid meanings in grammar. They folded truths into the structure of language, into the numerical value of letters, into the shape of the page. Knowledge became a labyrinth, not to keep others out, but to keep it safe. And perhaps to slow the seeker down. Because some truths cannot be given. They must be earned. Some doors do not open with a key, but with readiness. And the scribes knew this. They guarded those doors, not with weapons, but with time, with obscurity, with patience. Their role was not to reveal, but to remember. And in that remembering, they carried something sacred. But what happens when the last scribe is gone? When the last margin note is erased? When the fire reaches the shelves, and the scrolls curl into smoke? Does the knowledge die, or does it move? Does it migrate into other hands, other stories, other forms? We know that a few texts survived, through translation, through exile, through luck. But perhaps more survived than we think. Perhaps the scribes passed on more than words. Perhaps they passed on ways of seeing, ways of preserving meaning beneath appearance, ways of embedding insight in rhythm, in symbol, in silence. And those ways still breathe in unexpected places, in the structure of myths, in the cadence of sacred chants, in the logic of dream. Sometimes you find a phrase, ancient, worn, incomplete, and feel something stir in you, not recognition exactly, something older, something without name. That is the scribe's echo, a ripple from a hand long gone, not calling out for rescue, but reminding you that preservation is possible, that even now, even here, we carry the work forward. Each time we refuse easy answers, each time we seek depth, each time we tend to memory not as data, but as devotion. The library may have burned, but the scribes wrote in more than ink. They wrote in silence, and silence, if you listen long enough, will speak again. Not all burnings are done with fire. Some begin with a quill, with an edit, with a word crossed out and another inserted in its place. Then again in the next copy, and the next. Until the original disappears, not in flames, but beneath layers of deliberate misremembering. Erasure is rarely sudden. It is slow, surgical. And perhaps that's the part of Alexandria's loss we understand least. Not what was destroyed, but what was rewritten. Because what survives history is not always what was true. It is what was permitted. And somewhere in the fragile chain of transmission, between the scribe, the scholar, the emperor, the priest, choices were made. Not always out of malice, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of faith, sometimes simply because one version was easier to manage than another. The Library of Alexandria was, by design, a place of many voices. It held contradictions side by side, philosophies that disagreed, myths that clashed, scientific models that competed. It did not demand resolution. It allowed complexity to breathe. But complexity is dangerous. It breeds doubt. And in systems that depend on certainty, on doctrine, law, hierarchy, doubt is not tolerated. So simplification begins. Some texts are copied less frequently. Others are annotated with warnings. Still others are merged. Two sources fused into one, their nuances lost. Names are changed, dates adjusted, parables stripped of context and fitted to new agendas. And over time, the story shifts, until we no longer know we are reading a palimpsest. We think it is truth, but it is only the version that remained. The destruction of Alexandria was not just physical. It was epistemological. It was a narrowing of the lens, a reshaping of what knowledge even meant. Consider the chronology of history. We accept it as fixed, factual, but much of it was reconstructed centuries after the events it claims to describe. The timelines of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, even early Greece, are filled with conjecture, cross-referenced through king lists and astronomical events that may or may not have been recorded accurately. What if some of those records were altered? Not as a grand conspiracy, but as a series of small decisions, to align one history with another, to make a dynasty appear older, to erase the influence of an enemy culture, to merge myths so that they supported a new religion. These are not hypotheticals. They are documented tendencies. We know that early Christian scribes revised pagan texts to remove references to reincarnation, that Roman historians reshaped accounts of enemies to suit imperial narratives, that countless indigenous stories were collected by colonial scholars, then edited to fit a Western worldview. So how much of our ancient past is fabricated? Not wholly false, but curated, trimmed, repackaged. And if Alexandria held the older versions, the unedited scrolls, the wild and contradictory accounts, the raw myths before they were tamed, then its destruction served not only to erase memory, but to sanctify the new story, to clean the slate, to begin again. And when we begin again, we always simplify, We flatten timelines, we declare beginnings, we assign origins where none existed. We pretend the river has one source, when in truth it is a delta, a tangle of streams winding back through forgotten terrain. The great religions of the world were not born in isolation. Their doctrines, rituals, and symbols echo older traditions. Floods, virgin births, resurrections, sacred trees, all existed long before they were canonized. Alexandria may have preserved their ancestry, may have shown how belief evolved, branched, and borrowed. But that, too, was dangerous, because authority depends on singularity, on revelation, not evolution, and so the older stories were buried. Their fragments remain, but their roots are severed. We now treat knowledge like a pyramid, the past at the base, the present at the peak. But maybe it's more like a forest, messy, intertwined, regenerative, and perhaps Alexandria was the grove, the living center, cut down not just because of what it held, but because of what it revealed. That history is not a line, but a labyrinth. That truth is not a statue, but a shadow. And that our current version of the past is not inevitable, but constructed. Once that realization takes hold, everything changes. You begin to see the gaps, the inconsistencies, the myths that were once metaphors, now treated as literal events. The theories that were once open-ended, now taught as gospel. You begin to see the fingerprints, not of authors, but of editors, curators of memory, shapers of what we are allowed to know, and it is here that the silence of Alexandria becomes most haunting. Because we do not just mourn what was lost. We fear what was changed. Imagine a scroll that revealed the true age of the Sphinx, or one that documented a lost civilization beneath the sea, or a scroll authored by a woman that offered a model of the soul untouched by patriarchy, by conquest, by dogma. Imagine that these scrolls were not burned, but replaced. We would never know. We would only feel the faint pull of dissonance, the sense that something doesn't quite add up, that somewhere beneath the smooth surface of the official story, the bones of an older truth lie buried, waiting. We do not know if these scrolls ever existed, but we know this: those in power have always rewritten the past to shape the future, and the greatest act of control is not censorship. It is authorship. To tell the story first, to decide where it begins, to dictate the lens through which all else is seen. Alexandria threatened that. It preserved too many beginnings, too many truths, too many questions. And in the end, perhaps, it wasn't burned to destroy knowledge, but to make room for a simpler tale, one with fewer pages and tighter margins. Not everything is forgotten. Some things were never spoken at all. There is a kind of silence deeper than loss, a silence that predates memory, not because the words were burned, but because they were never written, because some knowledge, raw, unfiltered, uncontainable, refused to be caged by parchment, and perhaps, within the vast intelligence of Alexandria, that silence was honored. Perhaps the greatest wisdom it held was what it did not say. We imagine the library as complete, endless scrolls, infinite records, a catalog of every idea ever conceived. But what if that's not what it was? What if instead Alexandria was curated with restraint? What if its scholars knew that some truths couldn't be preserved without changing them? Because to write is to fix, to render something fluid into form. And once it's fixed, it stops moving. Perhaps some knowledge wasn't meant to be read, only lived. There are traditions, quiet, old, and nearly vanished, that speak of oral lineages, of teachings passed from mouth to ear, never captured in ink. Not because they were secret, but because they were sacred, too alive to survive transcription. A mantra loses something on the page. A ritual, reduced to instruction, dies. The gesture, the breath, the vibration, these are not literary. They're experiential. And in every culture that honored this way of knowing, the role of the teacher was not to explain, but to transmit. What if Alexandria had entire rooms for this? Not libraries of scrolls, but of silence. Places where knowledge was not stored, but invoked. Where initiates didn't read, but listened. Where the walls themselves hummed with memory. It may sound fanciful, but temples across Egypt, many of which predate the library, were designed not for volume, but for vibration. The way sound moved through their corridors. The way light touched certain corners only on specific days. These were not accidents, they were containers for living presence. So perhaps the library learned from them. Perhaps it didn't just preserve text, perhaps it preserved absence. Because what is left out of history tells us as much as what's kept. In the surviving lists of Alexandria's holdings, fragmentary inventories, second-hand accounts, there are gaps. Entire cultures missing. Unnamed authors. Subjects referenced but never explained. Did the scrolls ever exist? Were they destroyed? Or were they never written? The Dogon people of Mali preserved astronomical knowledge of Sirius B, an invisible star, centuries before modern telescopes confirmed its existence. How did they know? Polynesian navigators sailed thousands of miles using star maps memorized in song. Aboriginal Australians encoded ecological systems into myth, sustaining landscapes for 60,000 years without writing a single word. These aren't anomalies. They're reminders. That intelligence does not require literacy. That memory does not always need material form. And perhaps the library, for all its brilliance, understood this. Perhaps its scholars were not attempting to collect everything, but rather to honor what could be written and what could not. But then the fires came, and we, in panic, mourned what we lost, the scrolls, the names, the diagrams and translations, but we forgot to mourn the spaces between them. The teachings never transcribed, the ceremonies undocumented, the mysteries left intentionally unspoken. And in forgetting, we began to believe that only what is written is real, that truth requires citation, that memory must be filed. But even now, we feel the pull of what was not written, a sense that beneath all history lies a hum, a resonance that cannot be traced to paper, but to breath, to blood, to dream. Maybe that's why some knowledge feels familiar before we understand it. Why a single line of poetry can feel like déjà vu. Why an image, a gesture, a sound can break open something we thought was sealed. Because it's not being taught, it's being recalled. And in that recall, we glimpse the outlines of the unrecorded. Maybe that's the most haunting legacy of Alexandria, not the burned scrolls, but the ones that were never made. Because those would be irretrievable, not through archaeology, not through scholarship, only through resonance, through a listening deeper than sound, a remembering older than words. There are legends, unprovable but persistent, of schools in Alexandria that taught without text, where students learned through immersion, through movement, through silence, where questions were answered not by explanation, but by presence. Did these schools exist? We don't know, but the idea lingers that perhaps wisdom once meant something else, not accumulation, but attunement. And if that was true, then its loss would be total. Because how do you recover what was never recorded? How do you restore a practice that left no script? You don't. You feel for it. You sit in the quiet. And sometimes, if you're patient, it returns. Not as knowledge, but as knowing. There is a reason why some things resist documentation. They do not want to be observed. They want to be entered. They want to be remembered from the inside out. And perhaps the Library of Alexandria, great as it was, knew its limits. Perhaps it pointed gently toward what could never be filed or named, and now, all these centuries later, we are left with fragments, pages, ashes, and a silence that continues to echo with what was never said. But if we let that silence speak, if we listen not with the ear but with the heart just beyond the body, we may find that some truths don't need to be recorded to survive. They only need to be felt, tended, lived. And in that living, Alexandria breathes again, not as a place, but as a presence, a memory not of what was held, but of what was left untouched. There is a strange kind of amnesia that lives not in the mind, but in culture, a forgetting so deep we no longer realize we've forgotten. It shapes how we tell our history, how we define progress, how we name ourselves, and yet, at its root, there is always a moment, unseen, unmarked, when something was removed. A story, a thread, a root system too ancient to recall, but vital enough that its absence changed everything. Perhaps the fall of the Library of Alexandria was one such moment. Not just the loss of texts or knowledge, but the quiet death of a different kind of self. Before the fire, humanity might have seen itself as embedded, interwoven, not above nature, but within it, not separate from the cosmos, but shaped by it. The stories from that time spoke of cycles, of divine presence in every stone and river, of learning not as conquest, but as unfolding. But after the silence, the story shifted. The narrative of the human being changed. We became linear. We began to measure life in steps, in ladders, in upward motion. We placed ourselves at the top. We drew lines between mind and body, between man and nature, between this world and the next. The earth, once sacred, became resource. The heavens, once a mirror, became distant. What if Alexandria had preserved an older story, one in which humanity was not apex but witness, one in which consciousness was not accidental but inherent, one in which the human was not ruler but bridge? We still find traces of this older story in indigenous cosmologies, in mystical texts, in myths that refuse to vanish. They speak of humanity as steward, as dreamer, as voice of the in-between. But these are no longer the dominant narratives. They live on the edges, in ceremony, in poetry, and perhaps the scrolls of Alexandria would have placed them back at the center. What would it mean to understand ourselves that way? To see our minds not as machines, but as instruments, to see history not as a straight line, but a spiral, to see civilization not as progress, but as memory trying to resurface. Because maybe that's what we are, a species with amnesia. And maybe the library was the last place where the memory remained whole. We assume that identity is built from what we know, but what if it's shaped even more by what we've forgotten? Our models of civilization, of how it began, where it started, who built what, are thin compared to what might have been recorded in Alexandria. Think of the timelines we've inherited. Egypt in 3000 BCE, Sumeria, Greece, Rome, a slow crawl into complexity. But there are anomalies, structures that don't fit, tools that shouldn't exist, maps that depict Antarctica centuries before it was discovered, fossils that imply earlier migrations, texts that describe advanced knowledge in times we label primitive. Were these exceptions? Or were they fragments of a larger narrative, one that was cut? If the library held documents from older civilizations, if it had scrolls from cultures whose names we no longer know, then it may have offered a very different origin story. One where humanity is not climbing toward knowledge, but recovering from forgetting. A story where knowledge rises and falls like breath. Not linear, not cumulative, but rhythmic. That would change everything. Our sense of direction, our understanding of history, even our plans for the future. Because if we're in a cycle, if we've been here before, then the question becomes not, how do we advance, but what did we forget last time? And more urgently, what are we forgetting now? Without Alexandria, we lost more than knowledge. We lost context. And without context, we begin to misinterpret everything. Symbols become decoration. Ritual becomes superstition. Myth becomes lie. And the wisdom that once bound body, mind, spirit, and cosmos together shatters. We inherited the shards and called them whole. In the ruins of our memory, we built museums, labeled artifacts, drew timelines. But underneath it all, there is still that hum, that sense that something is missing, something too vast to name, too old to claim, a hum that follows us no matter how fast we progress. Maybe that hum is the story we used to tell ourselves, the one where we were not alone, not in the cosmic sense, but in the historical one, where other civilizations walked before us, not lesser, not cruder, but different, and maybe even wiser. We don't like that idea. It disrupts the myth of modernity. It threatens our foundations. But the echoes are growing louder. We find them in the alignment of megaliths, in genetic patterns, in flood myths that appear across continents, in the persistent idea that once, long ago, humanity remembered more than it does now. And maybe that memory was preserved in part by Alexandria. Not perfectly, but faithfully. Until it wasn't. Until the fire, or the silence, or the slow, careful pruning of the official narrative. We can't know for certain. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the final truth of Alexandria is not about what it stored, but what it dared to preserve. A vision of the human as more than consumer, more than producer, more than problem to solve. A being in relationship, with mystery, with the cosmos, with itself. And maybe, just maybe, the library's destruction wasn't only about knowledge. Maybe it was about identity, because to remember who we were is to ask who we are. And to ask who we are is to wonder what else has been forgotten, or worse, who decided we should forget. Forgetting is rarely accidental. It wears the mask of time, of entropy, of unfortunate loss. But behind that mask, there are hands, human hands, choosing, sorting, severing. The act of forgetting is often more deliberate than we like to admit. And sometimes, what is forgotten is not what we could not preserve, but what we were afraid to face. What if Alexandria was not only destroyed from the outside? What if, in some deep way, it was abandoned from within? A slow betrayal, not by fire, but by fear. There are moments in history when knowledge grows too large for the story we are telling ourselves, when a discovery threatens the fragile architecture of belief, of control, of identity, and in those moments, the most dangerous thing is not ignorance, it is insight, because insight changes us. It forces us to see differently, to unlearn, to step outside of certainty and into awe, and awe is not safe. Awe dissolves boundaries. It demands surrender. The Library of Alexandria, for all its splendor, may have reached such a threshold, a moment when the collection, comparison, and cross-pollination of knowledge began to reveal something larger than any one tradition could hold. Not just facts, but implications, connections. And connections are dangerous, because they breed unity, and unity, for those who depend on division, is a threat. Imagine the feeling of standing in that space, surrounded by scrolls from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, reading myths that mirrored each other, cosmologies that aligned, systems of thought that, despite distance and difference, spoke the same secret: that consciousness is primary, that the universe is alive, that we are participants, not observers, that knowledge is not possession, it is relationship. To hold that truth would be exhilarating, but also destabilizing, because it means we are not in control, that no single empire, no single priesthood, no single story holds the whole. And so perhaps, deep within the corridors of Alexandria, a tension began to rise, not just between cultures, but within minds. The realization that the truth was too vast for the structures built to contain it. And that realization may have sparked fear, not the fear of attack, but the quieter fear of transformation. What if this changes everything? What if the systems we built, of governance, of religion, of self, can no longer stand? What if the story we've told ourselves is only a shadow? These are the questions that haunt the edge of awakening. And not everyone wants to awaken. Some prefer the comfort of the known, the clarity of hierarchy, the illusion of control. And so the forgetting begins. First, subtly. Certain texts are deprioritized. Funding shifts. Rooms are sealed. Scholars retire under pressure. Copyists are told to exclude certain works. Translations are suspended. Philosophies once discussed freely are now whispered. Then, eventually, not spoken at all. It is a pattern as old as power. When knowledge becomes too big, the walls close in, and the fire is lit. Not always literal, sometimes bureaucratic, sometimes cultural, sometimes internal, because we don't always need flames to destroy a library. We just need to decide it is no longer useful, or worse, that it is dangerous. And in that decision, the forgetting is complete. But the fragments remain. They surface in strange places, in symbols carved into temple walls, in stories told in exile, in manuscripts hidden inside other manuscripts, and in the body, in dreams, in déjà vu, in the quiet sense that something important has gone missing. Because forgetting leaves fingerprints, especially when it is chosen. And if we follow those prints carefully, we begin to see the pattern. We begin to realize that forgetting is not just a historical accident. It is a psychological strategy. It protects the ego. It shields identity from collapse. And the deeper the truth, the more radical the forgetting required. So what truth was Alexandria brushing against? What was so unbearable that it had to be silenced? Maybe it wasn't a secret formula. Maybe it wasn't a map or a device or a prophecy. Maybe it was something far more disorienting. A mirror. One that reflected not just our potential, but our failure to live up to it. One that showed how much we once knew and how little we chose to carry forward. That we knew how to listen to the stars, to speak to the body, to hold myth and math as equal, to see the sacred in structure, the divine in detail, the whole in every part. and we forgot. Not because it was taken, but because we were not ready. Because to carry that knowing is to carry responsibility, not just for truth, but for beauty, for balance, for care, the kind of care that does not conquer, that does not consume, that does not divide, and so we let it go. And in its place, we built simpler stories, stories that favored control, that honored clarity over complexity. That made room for kings and popes and borders, stories that quieted awe, that reduced wonder to knowledge, knowledge to information, and information to utility. But still, beneath those stories, something stirs. A hunger. Not for facts, but for meaning. Not for explanation, but for remembrance. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, just before sleep, or just after waking, we feel it. That we have forgotten something important, something intimate, something ancient. And perhaps, in feeling it, we begin to undo the forgetting. Not with certainty, not with research, but with reverence, because some truths cannot be retrieved, only reawakened, and in that reawakening we do not recover Alexandria, we become it, a space where all things meet, where contradiction is welcome, where silence speaks, where memory is not static but alive, not a library of scrolls, but of soul, and intending to that space, through wonder, through inquiry, through love, we begin to remember, not just what was lost, but why we chose to lose it, and what it will take to carry it again. Ruins have a strange way of remembering. Even when the walls have fallen, when the stones have scattered, when the names are worn smooth by wind and time, something remains, not in what you can see, but in what you feel, a presence, quiet and persistent, like the lingering scent of incense long after the altar has been cold. Alexandria has such a presence. The modern city wears its past like a mask, harbors, highways, markets, dust. The sea still breaks along the same shore, but the old city sleeps beneath layers of concrete and forgetting. Tourists walk streets built over legend. Locals pass by walls that once hummed with the voices of dreamers. And somewhere, beneath it all, the library still breathes. Not literally, not in the form of scrolls waiting to be unearthed, but as a kind of psychic gravity, a pull, a hum of memory that refuses to fully fade. Because some places are not just locations, they are containers. And when what they once contained is torn away, the shape of the container does not disappear. It lingers, like a negative space in the collective mind, an echo carved into geography. We speak of lost cities as if they are gone, but cities are not just built of stone, they are built of thought, and thought, once born, leaves an imprint. Especially when it is shared, repeated, whispered through generations. Alexandria was not merely a hub of texts, it was a convergence point of imaginations, and imagination leaves a residue. Maybe that's why, even now, people still search, not for artifacts, but for atmosphere, for something felt more than found, a certain quietness in the sea air, a weight in the corners of the catacombs, a flicker in the mind when standing near the site where the Serapeum once stood, a temple, a daughter library, a vanished house of breath. The modern world doesn't have a good language for this. It wants coordinates. It wants evidence. But some knowledge resists capture. It chooses to survive not in proof, but in place. And Alexandria, even after centuries of erasure, still carries that choice. It is not alone. Other sites carry similar weight. The Oracle of Delphi, the temples of Angkor, the standing stones of Karnak, places where people still lower their voices, even if they don't know why. where silence feels less like absence and more like attention, as if the space is listening, watching, waiting. It's possible that the library was never meant to last in form, that it was designed, consciously or not, to dissolve, not into nothing, but into everywhere, that its scrolls would scatter, its symbols embed themselves in other cultures, its questions pass from mouth to ear to heart, disguised as poetry, as ritual, as dreams. There are legends of travelers who, centuries after the fire, claimed to receive knowledge in sleep, of scholars who dreamed in forgotten languages, of mystics who saw rooms that no longer stood, vaulted ceilings lined with stars, tables of glass, flame-lit corridors filled with wind and parchment, delusions or echoes. It is said that the subconscious is not bound by time, that it remembers beyond blood, beyond name. Perhaps some part of us walked those halls. Perhaps we carry its dust in our breath. There is an Arabic phrase, Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It refers to the great translation center in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age. But perhaps the phrase is older still. Perhaps the idea of a house of wisdom is less a building and more a pattern, a shape that repeats across time, a prototype like a spiral or a seed. What if the library was never truly singular? What if it was the latest expression of an older pattern, one that appears whenever humanity begins to remember itself? A gathering point, a moment of coherence before the next forgetting. We tend to think of Alexandria's destruction as an ending. But what if it was also a seeding, a diaspora of ideas, a scattering of potential? Sometimes what is shattered spreads further than what is preserved. Sometimes a fire carries more than it consumes. What was in those scrolls? Names, equations, lost maps, or perhaps intentions, ways of thinking, ways of seeing, and those ways, once released, do not vanish. They move, they take new shapes, and they find those who are listening. Even now, artists, scientists, philosophers, visionaries, across cultures and disciplines, stumble into echoes of the library. They speak of synthesis, of paradox, of wisdom that feels both ancient and unborn. They don't cite scrolls. They breathe resonance. Because the library is not a relic, it is a rhythm, one that reappears in moments of convergence, when science softens into art, when myth meets method, when language opens like a gate. And perhaps that rhythm is returning, not in a single place, but in many, not as a monument, but as a mood, a murmur beneath the noise of now, a sense that something wants to be remembered, not rebuilt, but recognized. So maybe the question is not, where is Alexandria, but what still carries its imprint, a fragment in a book, a tone in a chant, a structure in a dream, a pull toward mystery you can't quite name. We keep looking for ruins. But maybe the library is not behind us. Maybe it is ahead. Not a building to uncover, but a presence to awaken, a frequency that pulses through the gaps in our knowledge, inviting us not to recover, but to reimagine, to tune the self like an instrument, to walk as if every place is a portal, to listen as if silence is language, and to remember not the scrolls, but the space, the invitation, the breath between ideas. Alexandria may be gone, but the question it asked still hangs in the air. What will you do with what wants to return? What do we carry without knowing? Not in our hands, but in our questions, in the long silences between facts, in the places where curiosity lingers, even after the answers grow cold. Perhaps that is where the library still lives, not in archives, not in ruins, but in us. because forgetting is not always erasure. Sometimes it's incubation, a deep sleep beneath the surface, a dream that waits, not for discovery, but for readiness. What if some part of us remembers, not the scrolls, not the floor plans, but the feeling, the permission, the hum that filled the lungs of those who walked those ancient halls, not just with knowledge, but with the certainty that to know was to touch the divine. We do not live in that certainty now. We live in the fragments, a phrase that stirs something, a dream that feels older than your own life, a symbol you can't explain, but feel drawn to. We call it coincidence. We call it imagination. But what if it's contact? What if memory does not rise all at once, like fire? What if it returns in waves? There are people, perhaps you've met them, who seem to know something without ever being told. They speak not in lectures, but in metaphors. They feel truth in music, in movement, in intuition. They don't claim to have answers, but they walk with a kind of listening. Maybe these are the new scribes, not writers of scrolls, but carriers of resonance, not repeating the old knowledge word for word, but resounding it in a new key. And what if this is how it always returns? Not through excavation, but through embodiment, not through rediscovering the library, but becoming it. A person can become a vessel for memory, for inquiry, for presence, and in that vessel something sacred awakens, not because it is ancient, but because it is whole. It doesn't divide knowing from being. It doesn't treat truth as possession. It lets mystery breathe. That's what was lost. Not a building, not a catalog, but a relationship to the unknown, to the unmeasurable, to the sacred silence that lives beneath all knowledge. We try to fill that silence now, with data, with speed, with endless commentary, but beneath the noise, the ache remains, a low thrum in the soul, a quiet sense that something isn't complete, that the center doesn't hold, that we are missing not just answers, but the very questions that once gave shape to wonder. Alexandria was built on those questions, not to answer them, but to hold them, to create a space where contradiction was not threat, but invitation, where myth and math sat beside each other, not in conflict, but in conversation. That's rare now. We live in binaries, fact or fiction, true or false, sacred or profane. But the library remembered a time before the split. And maybe it invites us back there, not as escape, but as return. A return to a way of knowing that does not demand clarity, but cultivates depth. A way of knowing that welcomes mystery, that does not rush to explain, that bows first before what it doesn't yet understand. Perhaps that's what it means to be a guardian of lost knowledge, not to recover every detail, but to remember the stance, the humility, the listening, because knowledge, like music, needs more than notes. It needs silence, the pause between, the breath that lets meaning expand. We are taught to chase knowledge, to collect it, to control it. But what if it is not something to be caught? What if it is something to be entered? And what if the library, before it burned, was already trying to show us this, through its architecture, its contradictions, its refusal to resolve? Maybe that's why it was destroyed, not because it failed, but because it succeeded, because it invited people to remember too much. And now, here we are. Centuries later, sifting through the ashes, not to rebuild exactly, but to listen, for the hum, the trace, the question, not the ones we ask with words, but the ones that ask us in the stillness of night. What do you know that you cannot name? What calls to you without language? What do you carry, silently, for a future that has not yet arrived? These are the questions that do not fit in books. They live in dreams, in gestures, in the quiet devotion of those who tend memory, even when they do not understand it. So perhaps the library did not die. Perhaps it changed form. Perhaps it moved from the shelves into the soul, from architecture into awareness, from ink into imagination. And perhaps that was its final purpose, to plant itself in us, so that one day when the world was quiet enough, we would feel it stir again, not as information, but as invitation, a call to remember what cannot be taught, only felt, only lived. And in living it, we do not resurrect the library. We become its keepers, not of facts, but of wonder. Maybe what was lost was never meant to be found. Not because it is gone, but because it was never a thing to hold in the first place. Because some knowledge is not something we possess. It is something that passes through us, like wind through an open window. You can't trap it. You can only invite it in. And perhaps the Library of Alexandria was one long, slow invitation, not to answers, but to a different way of asking, a way that moved like water, a way that curved around certainty, that paused before every explanation and asked, "But what lies beneath this too?" We are taught to think of knowledge as cumulative, one fact stacked upon another, a tower of understanding rising steadily toward some enlightened pinnacle. But the library whispered something else. That the path of knowing isn't vertical, it's concentric, spiral, a return to the same questions again and again, but with new ears, and now, all these centuries later, we circle one final time around the fire. Not to rebuild the tower, but to remember the circle. Because the library was never a monument. It was a movement, a gathering of breath and ink and longing, a sanctuary for questions that were too delicate for doctrine, a place where opposites touched, where priests and mathematicians passed each other in stone corridors and bowed in quiet respect, not because they agreed, but because they understood they were both approaching the same great silence from different angles. And now that silence is ours to enter, what do we do with it? That is the real inheritance, not the scrolls, not the names, but the permission to sit with not knowing, to study not only the light, but the dark, to wonder without needing to resolve, to hold a question like a sacred flame. We've reached the end of the story, but stories like this never end. They dissolve into other stories. They echo in strange places. They come back dressed in new language. The library may be gone, but it shows up in small moments, in the hum behind a piece of music that moves you, though you can't explain why, in the chill you feel when standing before ruins older than time, in the ache you carry when you realize how little we remember and how much we're still trying. And maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering isn't about finding the missing texts. Maybe it's about becoming the kind of mind that would have walked those halls. Curious, reverent, in no rush. There are still those who carry the fire. You see them sometimes, not on stages, not in headlines, but at the edge of conversations, listening closely, in libraries, wandering the stacks, not looking for anything in particular. In dreams, waking with a sentence in a language they do not speak. These are the ones Alexandria still touches, the new stewards, the quiet ones, the ones who don't seek power through knowledge, but presence. And through them, the library continues. Not as history, but as practice. Because what Alexandria offered was not a collection of ideas. It was a way of relating to them, with awe, with humility, with openness to the possibility that the most important things we will ever know might not make sense, might not be measurable, might only arrive in metaphor, in symbol, in the spaces between. And in that space, something breathes. You felt it, haven't you? That subtle tremor behind the surface of things. The sense that what you were taught was never the whole story, that some deeper rhythm pulses beneath history, beneath science, beneath faith. That feeling isn't a flaw in the world, it's a thread. And if you follow it, not in haste, not with force, but with patience, it might lead you to a kind of memory that doesn't live in words. It might lead you to yourself. Because if the library lives on, it does so in every being who dares to ask the forbidden question, who dares to turn inward instead of outward, who lets mystery speak without needing to translate it, who watches the stars, not for instruction, but for reflection, and who walks through the world with the quiet understanding that to know something is not to control it, but to enter relationship with it. The knowledge that was lost was never just about the stars, or the body, or the gods. It was about how to listen, how to see, how to remain open to the unfolding. And in that openness, a new kind of clarity emerges. Not sharp like a sword, but soft like dawn. Not absolute, but attentive. The kind of clarity that doesn't answer everything, but makes you feel, deep in the chest, that you are part of something vast, that you are not here to dominate, but to witness, not here to master, but to remember, and perhaps to begin again. With fewer certainties, with deeper reverence, with the willingness to say, I don't know, but I am listening. Because somewhere, beneath the ashes of Alexandria, a question still flickers. It is not a question to solve. It is a question to carry. And as long as someone is carrying it, the library is not lost. It is still unfolding. One listener at a time, one breath, one silence, one story that never truly ends.